Hello, welcome to a presentation on informal writing, or what the writing scholar Peter Elbow usually calls low-stakes writing. For this video, we're going to talk a bit about some of the reasons why using informal writing can be particularly helpful in the teaching of writing, some of the types of informal writing that you might want to use, and lastly, some thoughts about how to assess informal writing in your class or evaluate it as well. Okay, so we'll get started by thinking a little bit about the questions of why assign low stakes writing. And I think it comes down to largely two of the key ideas in thinking about the ways you can use writing in your classroom. Writing to learn, learning to write, or in opposition to the idea of writing that is used to show whether or not a student has achieved mastery of a subject or a concept. So writing to learn obviously speaks to the idea that you're using writing as a way to get students to understand material, concepts, ideas, and other types of assignments with writing are focused more on the actual writing itself. Low stakes writing is great for taking a chance at focusing on one of these elements and doing it in such a way, as implied in the name, that there isn't as much risk involved for the students in terms of how difficult this will prove in terms of their grades. And that leads to the second reason to do this, which is that this is a place where students are more likely to take risks. One of the frustrating things that I've found over the years in teaching writing is that when students are working on graded assignments, they tend to aim as much as possible for not taking risks, of trying to get a sort of solid grade more than anything else. And that doesn't always lead, of course, to the best kinds of writing. So because there's low stakes, students are more willing to take risks with both their ideas and with their writing itself. Maybe in low stakes, they're more willing to break from the patterns that they've used before this that you want to get them to break from. So one of the easiest ways to get started in this is to think about which ways we can use low stakes writing. And the most common way I would say that people use low stakes writing is free writing. And free writing is, as it somewhat suggests, is meant to be sort of loose, often in-class writing, generative writing, a way to create ideas, get started, and essentially not focus on the writing itself, but as a way to produce ideas as well. So here are a couple of examples of ways that I've used free writing in the past. Don't be too dazzled by these presentation effects. Okay, so here's one from a class that I teach where I'm trying to get them actually to free write to generate ideas that they can use for their paper. So the idea here was to get them started in the beginning of class and have them spend a few minutes, maybe 5-6 minutes. Sometimes I'll go as long as 10, and get them to do this to produce ideas. And one of the key things that I always use in my free writes is this sort of notion that they should keep writing the whole time. And as I put in the instructions here, telling people that, if you're frustrated, just keep saying, I don't have anything to say. And that usually gets you so sort of even more frustrated that other ideas come back. But the idea is to keep producing, not worry about prose style, grammar, things along those lines, just generate ideas. And so this one was focused on that for a class of romantic comedies. And here's a similar one that I used as a way of sort of thinking about the kind of key ideas in certain kinds of novels as well. But free write can be used for really anything. And I find that free writing is a great way to combine the connections between speaking and listening and writing. Because if I can come up with a good question that helps generate ideas for discussion, then this is a way to start the class, which is great. Chris Anson, another writing scholar, suggests using free writes at the very end of class, he calls them 1-minute papers, to kind of gather what students have learned from the class, give them a chance to reflect on that way. But I think you can use free writes at any point, a way to sort of see if students have actually understood a concept. Quickly try to explain this concept in 3 minutes, or something along those lines. And I think that that can be really helpful. But I often find that if I can come up with a good free write question to begin a class, it's going to guide discussion for almost the entirety of that class. Okay, so what else can you do besides free writing? One of the other ways that I've been using informal writing is what I call targeted responses. And these are, some people call these kind of response papers. They're usually done out of class, but sometimes I'll spend the first 10 minutes of class asking them to do that. And unlike free writing, I want them to pay a little bit more attention to the writing, especially if it's out of class, more organized and more systematic in this regard. So one of the things about targeted responses, it allows you to focus them on an idea, focus them on learning a concept particularly that you want them to learn, or focus on a sort of task related to learning a writing technique in a particular way. So I'll give you a couple examples here. This is one that's focused much more on an idea, getting them in class to think about what happens at the end of the novel, but also what is its significance, right? So one of the things, of course, targeted responses can help you do is make sure that the students are reading and reading critically, right? So I think also targeted responses in terms of ideas can be really great if you're assigning secondary sources that are challenging, and you want the students to begin the process of trying to understand those before they come into class and really focus them in that way. And the next one is a more complicated assignment. This was out of class, that also allows them to combine thinking about the text for the class, which was a film, but specifically on the ideas of how to use evidence as you're working on developing an essay. And this is obviously a key concept for just all kinds of things, but particularly in terms of writing as well. Okay, so one of the most common ways that people use informal writing is probably journals. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of different ways to use journals. Individual journals are certainly the most common, asking students to keep a journal over a certain period of time, collect those journals, give feedback on those journals. There's a book by Toby Fulwiler called The Journal Book that goes into a great deal of detail about how often he used journals in this way. This is not something I will admit that I've had a ton of success with, in part because I find that it's harder to keep track of when students are doing these journals and things along those lines. I've tried before team journals where people keep journals together. This seems to be great in conception. It doesn't always work as easily in terms of the actual the performance of this in that way, because you have to have everyone doing it or else it's not really a team journal. And the last journal I'm going to talk a little bit about that I've used the most recently is a reading journal, which asks students to focus specifically on writing about the reading that they have done and in specific kinds of ways. And what I'm using it for is to try to get students to interact very directly with the material for the course. And one of the things I like about the reading journal in this way is, as you can see here, here's an explanation from the assignment, and here's directions about the kind of writing that they should be doing in it. And what I find that's really helpful about this is that students can then usually cite very specifically from passages, because I'm asking them to do that. They can bring this in class. It's a place for them to write down questions that they have. And what I do with this particular journal is I have them use it for 2 texts in the class. And I collect it after the first time and don't really assess it, but I give them feedback on whether or not it's working for them and ways they can improve that in some ways. And I think the key with most of these informal writings, and I'll talk a little bit at the end here about assessment, is that you want to show that you've interacted with them, with the students. You don't have to go into great detail about doing that, but I often try to pick out a passage or 2 from their reading journal that I found intriguing and comment on that and give them some thoughts about that. Okay. So these are some of the further details about that and the sort of logistics of how I make those work. The other kind of informal writing that's very common, and certainly in the time of the pandemic, when people have had to teach remotely, became much more common, is Moodle forums, which essentially follow the idea of blogs and blog posting, I would say, more than anything else. So I think these are similar to targeted responses. You can see an example of one that I gave here. I'd say the key difference of this is that they are public to the other students in the class, or at least they can be on Moodle, and that's the way I've done them. And one of the things that I've also done on Moodle is encourage the students to respond. In fact, I build it into the assignment that they need to respond to at least one other student's response. In the best case scenarios, this becomes a kind of model of or echo of conversation where one student is responding and sometimes the student who wrote the response will come back and so forth. It doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes, of course, as the pressure of the semester goes, if you say do it once, they'll do it once, and things along those lines. But I do like the fact that this is also a way for me to respond in the sense that I sometimes will jump in to these responses and give my own comments as well. So this is a longer one, around 300 words. And I think you can also keep these pretty short. So this was one where I asked them to just say something in a few sentences about how they felt about this. And I just said, respond to more than one response here, because the actual prompt asked for just something very briefly. So the last thing I'm going to talk about here in terms of informal writing is letters. And this is something that, as I've been teaching here a long time, has been an assignment that's been associated with me. And a lot of faculty have tried over the years as well. And I think it's a really great assignment. And it's not real. People sometimes call it after me, but it's not really my assignment. I got it from Toby Fullwiler during the first writing workshop that I attended, and he was the person who helped run that. And letters are really meant to be literally a letter that students write to me about the material for the class. And here is the assignment that I give, and you can pause the video if you want to take a look at it. And I think that this assignment does a lot of interesting things. It's sort of a space between a journal and a targeted response, because I don't give them too much restriction on what they write about. I want them to write about what they want in terms of the material for the course. I also build in a little leeway that they can occasionally bring up personal stuff, but I tell them that's not the focus of these letters. And the key here is that they have to think about an audience. So I tell them to address me in this way. And I think that's helpful too, because this is one of the writing elements that I really try to stress when I'm teaching writing, is to think about your audience. So they should be thinking about the fact that they're writing to me. And the key part of this also is that there's a loop back, which is that 10 of the weeks of the semester, I also write a letter back to the students. And I have found that this is a great way of getting a strong sense of what's going on with the course, what the students are understanding, where their questions lie. I often encourage students, when I teach difficult classes like literary theory classes, to try to use the letters to see if they understand the concept, try to explain it to me. Gives me a second chance to explain concepts back to them when I write letters to them. And the other thing that letters have done for me is it's solved the problem of how to get the voices of students that are invested in the class but are not that comfortable talking in class, but get their voice into the class. And letters have been a great way of doing that. I will say they are fairly work intensive. And so in a given semester, I wouldn't recommend using the letters in more than one class. But I do think they are one of the best uses of informal writing that I've found in the years that I've taught. So I'm going to end here by focusing a little bit on how to grade informal writing or low stakes writing. As it implies, this should not be something where you're putting too much weight on any of these assignments for the students. And I think that you want to think about also making sure that if you want to use informal writing, that you're not stuck grading it continuously as well. And I think that's kind of crucial to this process. So I'm going to talk about two sort of models for doing that. One is simply to use effort-based model, which is that if you complete the assignment to the requirements of the assignment, you get full credit on the assignment. And that's how I do the letters. The letters work out sort of easily in that I ask students to write 10 letters for a semester. If they do 10, they get full credit on the assignment. If they do 9, they get 90% of the credit and so forth. So they really get a chance to decide that. With 10, they have a chance to take some weeks off, but if they take too many weeks off, then their grade reflects that. I went to a purely effort-based model in recent times in terms of targeted responses too, sometimes sort of saying that essentially if you hit everything that I want you to hit, that's a B plus for this, but you can get higher than that or you can get lower than that depending on whether or not you've turned them all in or the quality that you've done. So there's a little quality element in that as well. The other way of moving through the grading relatively easily is through a kind of brief, easy grading rubric, something like this. And this is largely borrowed from the writing scholar Chris Anson. And essentially, this is a way to sort of look at their writing and quickly give an assessment of what the issue is. Usually when I do this, I will admit that I try to add a comment about why they got this as well, but it's usually a one sentence or so comment, which is because the rubric, of course, doesn't get into much detail about their assignment, but it's a way to make sure that they know that I've read the assignment and to interact with them a little bit more specifically in the work that they've done. The rubric is a pretty efficient way of doing this. It's essentially a slightly more specific model than the check plus model, and yes, you'll have to convert this obviously to a grade at the end if this is the way you want this to go. You can still use this also for the effort-based model, which is that you could essentially do exceptional effort, met the basic requirements, and was deficient as the three choices, and then you have a chance to get over the B plus with the exceptional effort. Everything and met the basic requirements follows the B plus, and that when I do that effort-based model, that B plus area is a pretty broad category of doing that, and then deficient as well speaks for itself. So thanks very much. I hope you will consider using informal writing. I think it's one of the great tools for both improving student writing, getting students invested in writing, and also using writing for students to help learn the material for your course. Thanks.